Hello, and welcome to the Overcoming Podcast with your host, Adriana Lewin. Before we jump into today's episode, if you could please kindly subscribe to this podcast, and don't forget to follow me on Instagram at _Adriana_Lewin. Hello, and welcome to the Overcoming Podcast. I am super excited to bring back a really loved guest here, and I wanted to actually intro it by going, he's back. We are bringing back Matthew Swartz. He is a psychotherapist, speaker, coach. If you haven't seen his other episodes, just make sure and check it out in the list below. And today I really wanted to bring Matthew on to speak to, drum roll please, basically business and fatherhood. And this could be just in essence, fatherhood, really, business leaders, entrepreneurs, CEOs, all of those, right? Like any father that is in a place of business and leadership, and how fatherhood impacts them, whether it's the transition into fatherhood after you've been, hustling for years, or you've been hustling for years and realizing, oh my gosh, fatherhood is has been second in my priority. So thank you so much for coming on here, Matthew. And I'm really excited to talk about all things fatherhood with you.
Me too. I think I'm a good person to talk about it with because it was a struggle initially for me. And, the majority of I work with high performers and, it's, I don't love admitting that transition was hard for me, but I think it's been very helpful in my work with a lot of other, and this is certainly true for some others as well, who were moving out of sort of particular high performance leadership lifestyle into parenthood, and how very different it can be.
Yes, it is, just as women struggle transitioning into motherhood. Yes, obviously we love it, but it's still a transition, right? Like your lifestyle changes, the priorities change, and you really have to weigh your commitments and what you're getting yourself into. So, you in the previous episode identified as a fellow high achiever over, like, what did you say? Something about
I might have said recovering perfectionist.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how, for you personally, has that looked from being this high achiever, not that you're not still high achieving, but doing that hustle and moving into fatherhood? What did that look like for you? And what was the struggle that you noticed?
Yeah. So I'll just tell my story, because I find that when I have these conversations, that's the most helpful thing. I spent a bunch of time building my practice and doing my stuff and achieving and working 50, 60 hours a week. And I loved it. I loved hustling. I loved the networking meetings 2 or 3 times a week in the mornings, and the networking meetings after work at night. I'm this, bubbly extrovert. So
I was about to say, are you an extrovert? Because
deeply,
it exudes from you.
I had an introverted friend tell me, oh, I get it. So I'm coming to these things and you're stealing my energy. That's what's happening. And I guess I don't like that, but yeah, I thrive on that, energy. Right. So, and not everybody's that way, but that was my story. So I was happy going 1,000,000 miles a minute. And, even when I was just dating my, fiance, girlfriend, whatever she was at the time, at different periods, she is not that way. And she would also often say to me, like, this isn't sustainable. You're going to explode. You're going to, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's great, and then we got pregnant. And my first reaction was fear. Very scared, because I knew it was going to change everything, and I didn't want everything to change. And certainly that wasn't helpful for her. But it began sort of this journey of having to work through a bunch of things. It was also the turning point for me that got me into trauma work, because I started
Wow.
recognizing that for me, the fear was presenting as anger and irritability, right? Even though cognitively, I didn't want to be upset that this transition was happening, right? I wanted to be happy. My nervous system was not into that.
Can I interrupt for just a
Of
second?
course.
So if it was coming out as irritability, and anger, was that before your child was born? Like as soon as you're like, oh my gosh, we're about to have a baby, like, or was it mostly after?
I think probably it was like lower level irritability that built up throughout the pregnancy.
Okay.
And probably my wife would tell you that during the first pregnancy, it probably presented initially as more dissociative, like more avoidant. Like I wasn't there, or I was avoiding spending time, or, and I think that as things built and it was less and less, she needed more help, she needed more support. That's, I'm a very sort of, committed person, right? When I make a
Mm-hmm.
decision, I'm in. And so I think as the amount of energy I had to put towards this new thing
Mm-hmm.
increased, and certainly I think greatly increased after the baby was actually born, that irritability became greater and greater, and that anger became greater and greater. When I say anger, it wasn't like yelling or throwing things, right? But I was definitely
Short-tempered.
frustrated,
Yeah.
and my wife would probably say very critical. There was a lot of like
Oh,
moments where, why haven't you done this? Why did you do that? Why couldn't we do this? Why couldn't we, like everything could be better, or could be done better, or should have been done differently. And that's what it looked like for me. Certainly it's different for everybody, but I think for a lot of perfectionist high performers, it does come out as irritability and criticism.
yeah. Criticism. Oh, one of the four horsemen. If you do the Gottman theory, that's like one of the, actually, they say, no, contempt is, they say the worst, but criticism is just as bad and damaging to the relationship.
That is what our couples therapist has said to us. Yes. And that has definitely, honestly, been something that I've had to work on consistently since that turning point. Because it
Okay.
is, because, for me, and again, I think this is similar for a lot of perfectionists, I'm always viewing the world, what could be done better, right? So if there's an experience that occurs, my brain automatically goes to, how could we improve this for next time? Right. And that presents as criticism, because then I go, why did you do X? You should have done Y. Right.
Wait a
Or,
second. Hold on. So what I'm hearing is a fixer, like what all the women in the world say, "Oh my gosh,
yeah,
my husband is such a fixer when it comes to situations." So the
yeah.
fixer is a little bit of that critical drive. It has a
Oh,
critical drive.
it absolutely is. If you, so you look at, okay, so we're going to go on a tangent here. Okay.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
no, this is great. So I have this model of fear responses, right? Some
Hmm.
people work off of 3 fear responses: fight, flight, and freeze. Some
Hmm.
people are starting to work off of the 4 fear responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Okay.
Yes.
I work off of 6. So
Okay.
there's fight, flight, and freeze. I'm assuming I shouldn't like explain what each of those is. Maybe some other
Right.
podcasts can do that, but I will explain the other 3, which are fix, flex, and fawn. Right.
Okay.
So we started to get really big into this fawn thing. We've got a lot of good
Yes.
literature talking to us about the fawn response, which is that, basically I'll follow you around and do everything you want and give you love, and hopefully you'll take care of me and keep me safe in return. And
Hmm.
at the best, this is people pleasing. And at the worst, this is what we see in abusive relationships, right? Where
Right.
people stay inside abusive relationships, hoping if they just do the right thing, they'll get that love. Right. I think we all have a fawn response. I certainly, my wife gets
Hmm.
angry at me and I go, okay, what can I do? How can I make it better? Right.
Hmm.
Is part of that. But that's a little different than the fix response. And the fix response targets experiences or things, and maybe sometimes people, right? The fixed response, if I'm targeting a person, is I want to help make you healthier, or I want
Mm.
to help, you need to change this belief. Like when I try to get my wife to believe certain things, or when I try to get her to do something differently, right?
Yeah.
That's that fixed response. And the fixed response is I have a fear response towards certain pain, right? And I'm going to try to control and engineer the world around me to avoid that pain in the future. And as it builds up, it builds up, it builds up, and I get better and better at doing that, the fear response actually grows. Whereas what may be more helpful is learning how to digest and tolerate that pain so it doesn't keep triggering that fear response, right? But for me, I grew up with a perfectionistic mother, right? And so there's a lot of that fixed response that's just inherently ingrained in, because every time I did something that upset her, I became responsible for the emotion. And then I had to figure out, okay, what do I do next time to make it better? And I think, again, in my work with a bunch of perfectionists, that's often what it is
yes,
I've learned to avoid a negative emotional response from a parent by continuing to try to iterate my behavior, but there's no end to it, right? It's,
oh my gosh,
you spend the rest of your life trying to cater yourself to, making everybody happy, and it's never going to happen.
Like, my mind is blown right now because I'm like, yeah, that resonates with me. And actually in my upbringing, perfectionism was actually glorified. And you and I have had side conversations, right? Yeah. Where we talked about me and my recovery from perfectionism. Yeah. And that was part of it. It was realizing, wait a second, hold on. Perfectionism actually is not a good thing. Like, why do I keep idealizing perfectionism when that's unattainable? Right?
Because at some point it kept you safe.
Yes.
Because at some point it got you love. Right.
Yes.
It's a defense mechanism for a reason. But yeah, that whole reevaluation of, and finding that balance, right? Yep. I always want to grow and get better. Yes. But if I'm continuing to initiate that perfectionistic fixed response at the cost of the things that I care the most about, my relationships, my business, my fun, my peace, my purpose, whatever, that's where we got to figure out how to moderate that. Are we going to stop it? Probably not. But can we learn to moderate it? Yeah, yes, absolutely. We can.
Keep it in check a little bit. Yeah, that was actually because I sat on this podcast idea for literally 2 years. And then that perfectionism was like, don't do it. What are people going to say? It's not going to be perfect enough, blah, 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 blah. Like all the negative talk. And I was like, okay, maybe we're not going to do this. And finally, when I had that realization, because I do go to therapy for myself, realizing, holy crap, this is the culture in my family. Like, perfectionism was glorified. And if, you were kind of made to feel less than if you didn't have that same mentality. Not that they wanted you to achieve perfectionism, but to strive for perfectionism was more of the mentality, right? So, but anyway, I digress. I want to go back.
This is important. If I can this is important, right? Because what you just said, and we talked about this a little last time, but what you're noticing is how shame is embedded underneath that pattern. Right. So if I keep doing better and keep doing perfect and keep fixing and fixing, then I don't have to feel that shame. Right. So if I'm going to get out of this hole, not only do I have to process through the anger, I have to recognize that anger is probably blocking shame or fear. Yeah. Usually both. Right. So there's all of this digging that goes on. And, if you're trauma informed, you understand it's these layers of the onion you slowly peel back. Yes. Right. But that can be really hard, again, for sort of like cognitive based high performers who are like, okay, just what's the solution? What's this? No, we gotta feel right. So ultimately, what got you here in front of the mic is you had to process that emotion. The thought changed, the insight changed, certainly, but that opened the door to you working through some of that emotion. And that's what then can create that behavioral change, in my opinion.
Yes. I tell you what, therapy has been a game changer for me. I mean, being a therapist is one thing, the things, but like having someone take a bird's eye view of your landscape, it's definitely a game changer. But back to the last.
So I'll do this one quickly. So this is the fun. I like this one. This is the fun one. This is called flex. So that lizard that puffs its neck out to look really big, or that the moth that looks like an owl, or the guy at the bar that's like, come at me, bro, but he's never going to do anything.
Yeah.
That's the flex response. It's halfway in between. You can nest these together. They're not separate. They're intertwined. They work on biological systems. The flex response is actually a combination between the fight and the freeze response.
Uh-huh.
So I'm fighting,
I
but
could
I'm
see
not
that.
actually fighting, right? So
Yeah.
it's both of those channels firing kind of intermittently. And yeah, so you have the flex response. And but it's the same with the other responses, in my opinion. And again, there's some research showing this that I really enjoy. That fixed response is actually a combination between the fight and the flee response. So I'm trying to run away from the pain, but I'm doing so by trying to change the thing. So I'm
Yes.
going back and forth between, okay, let me change this, but I want to get away from the pain. And so it's this sort of really quick oscillation between
Uh-huh.
fight and flee that's almost happening at the same time that produces that fixed response. And then again, the fawn response is really a combination between the flee and the freeze response.
Yes.
And so, because you're stuck in the situation, but you're trying to get away from the pain. What do I need to do to make it stop? What do I need to do to make it stop? Right. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I see them sort of as all biologically intertwined, and then they present themselves in different situations in different ways, depending on the context, depending on your sort of, conditioning, et cetera, et cetera.
So we're gonna come right back in. I know I took everybody way out here. We're gonna reel it back in, and we're gonna go back into your story. So how that was impacting you,
Yeah.
as an entrepreneur.
So I'm getting pissed all the time. This is still before the kid is born, right? So I can see it coming. I'm not going to be able to spend 50, 60 hours a week at work, right? My wife is telling me this isn't working. I'm also able to see that at the same time, I noticed that this big thriving anxiety practice, ongoing groups, ongoing workshops, ongoing individuals. I mean, I waitlist. So business wise, it was all wonderful, but I also noticed my clients were stalling out at about 70%. And I noticed the same for me. And back to your comment about, us as therapists, as healers, as any doctor, any healer going through therapy, especially for therapists, a lot of us became therapists because we had therapy as kids. But a lot of our therapy as kids was, here's what you need to do to be better, to get the people around, your parents, the people at school, to be happy, right? And then going back to therapy as an adult can be an entirely different experience and can be really hard. Like, I'm a therapist, I'm a healer, like I'm supposed to have this all figured out, right?
I know.
So,
I
we go
know.
back to therapy. I was lucky enough to find it very trauma informed. I went to EMDR. I did a bunch of deeper work, allowed me to unpack all of this stuff. But again, your journey getting to that podcast, being able to go back as an adult, and there's work we can do as adults that we can't do as kids. I
Yes.
firmly believe that. Like,
Yes.
I don't think you can really engage in trauma recovery until you're an adult in an established safe situation, because then
Yes.
that allows you to bring your safe-ish nervous system into the past, into the rest of your limbic system. So doing that work, not only was I unpacking, how do I transform my life to adapt to what's going on in front of me, but it is also understanding how my early experience, my childhood, my traumas, whatever, set me up to make this transition so difficult. At the end of the day, one of the reasons I spent so much time at work was because family had become a painful thing for me. And the reality is, like, on the scale of things, my family's not horrible. Let's be clear. My parents both care about me, and they're, out there doing their thing. And my kids have contact with my parents, of course. Actually, we all live in the same area, but the way, part of it's my ADHD and the way my nervous system is set up, and that's may or may not be applicable to anybody else. But what I didn't realize is how subconsciously I had formed these negative associations with family and with child rearing. And so I had to deconstruct that as time went on. And I also had to figure out, okay, like, I love doing this work. This meets my needs. I go to work, I don't feel tired after, I feel full. How do I balance going over here with taking care of the things I need to do with my family, including, I mean, this is actually really interesting and perfect. This week, my kid got so sick. We had an ultrasound on Tuesday, and my wife had him in the hospital yesterday. So far,
Wow.
everything's okay. But it was one of those, like, 4 years ago, I would have just been like, don't bother me, I'm working. And at this point, it's like, okay, what do I need to do? I'll take time off. I'll go, like, to this. I had to cancel a networking event last night because I had to stay home with my youngest kid so she could take my oldest to the hospital. And it's like, well, in the past, I would have been super angry about it, or I wouldn't have done it. And now I was okay. It doesn't mean I was thrilled, right? It may seem like a little thing, but for me, and I think, again, a lot of high performers and a lot of perfectionists, being able to get to the point where, okay, I can take time off work. And not only that, but I can be present with my child when I do it. And that's, not just in the crises, but in it, I think it's really more about the day to day, right? Okay. For me, Thursday mornings are my mornings with my kids. Can I be present with them? Can I not ruminate about work? Can I not try to get on my phone or get on my laptop and figure out what I need to schedule or answer client emails from yesterday or any of that? So whether it's in the crises or it's in the regular day, can we be present? Can we work through the negative emotions that come up when we're pulled away from the thing that's given us, so much sense of self over the years?
So I have a social media post that I'm going to be posting next week because I think it's really relevant to the one I'm publishing for you next week.
Yeah.
And it's not exactly what you said, but I think it's communicating the same thing, that basically high achieving can be a trauma response.
Yes.
Emphatically, yes.
Emphatically, yes. What would lead somebody to build a company, or the kind of companies that maybe not intentionally drain large amounts of natural resources away from the world? What would cause somebody to build a company that has 80 different arms doing 80 different things, taking money from everywhere, all of that, right? What are they running from? What do they think they need? Right? Whether it's amassing a dragon's hoard of gold, or getting everybody to think they're super smart or love them or whatever, right? What pain are you running from? And when I look at the world's biggest problems, I hope this is like, I'm not saying, for instance, I'm not saying capitalism is evil, but I am saying that capitalists with trauma are creating trauma for everybody else through the filter of their business.
Ooh, that's interesting. Okay, so I'm just going to go off on a tangent because you saying that immediately brings to mind the idea. There's so many different companies that value parents transitioning into parenthood with, paid maternity leave, paid paternity leave. And in the US, our paid time off, our system is like so broken. And then you go across the seas and
in Europe, right? I have people that get 2 years off.
Yeah. And not only
and their
that,
job's
but they get
waiting for them when they get back, right?
Yeah. Or they get 2 hours off in the middle of their day to go have lunch, right? Like everything shuts down. Everybody's going to have a 2-hour lunch and a siesta or whatever at home. And just the idea of incorporating the value of family, right, into the business. That's not really prevalent in our society in the United States. And so you saying capitalism, right, can be a beautiful, fruitful thing. It's obviously needed. But when it's done in the context of that trauma response, so I'm going to bring it back to you. I'm going to bring it back to you in the sense of like, what were you running from or what were you avoiding, right? Because a lot of times we don't realize our trauma response is that we're running away from something. We're seeking, and I kind of let myself in that too, right? Like you're seeking that satisfaction and that, I am good enough. I can do things right. Or, Yeah, so it's either avoidance or you're seeking something that you said you like you said that we need to make us feel better about
Right.
ourselves. So for men, what is it that you typically see? Like,
Uh,
is it running from, running towards? Like, what is it?
yes.
Yes.
Right.
I know, I love
I
that.
think it's, like I always try to make it as simple as humanly possible. It's two things, right? We're running from pain and we're running to love. Now, guys don't love that word. So sometimes it's like respect or
There you
approval
go.
or identity or what, but it's love, right? It's all fear and love, baby, right? It's, I am running from the pain of being constantly corrected as a child. I'm running from the pain of never being good enough, right? I'm running from, and again, these are perceptions, right?
Right.
If you ask my parents, they're never going to tell, took my dad out for his birthday 2 nights ago, and I'm talking about some of these things, and he's like, it's just easier for him. And it just, he loves me very much. And he never would have, thought that was going on, right? He couldn't see that. They couldn't see that. But that was the messaging. That's what I filtered. Maybe that's my personality or my genetics
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, but running from that pain, right? I had created a really negative association with like suburbia because that's how I grew up. But in order to get my dream job moving into private practice, I had to move back home. And
Mm-hmm.
so there was this relationship around my environment and the pain the environment caused, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's whatever pain, and everybody's is a little different, right? What am I running from? And what am I running to? And it's love, it's approval. Like, I'm really friggin' good at this. I'm blessed. Like, I was a therapist in middle school. I was helping my friends with their
Mm-hmm.
problems, right? And I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
figured out how to get paid for it, which is
Yep.
great. And my clients love me. And
Were
not
you
only do they,
also the kid that was getting in trouble for talking too much in class?
oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, right. So, natural talents and gifts. I can't stop
Yes.
talking. That's why I'm a great podcast guest. It's just who I am, right? And now I'm not interrupting class. Um, yeah, and trying to get love for those things that come naturally to us and being able to do that. And then are you going to want to stop? Come
Right.
on, right? Like, I'm not going to get love in the middle of my wife's postpartum chaos. She doesn't have energy to pat me on the head and tell me what a good job I'm doing. She's in pain. I got to
Mm-hmm.
take care of her, right? So or my 2-year-old, my little, or even let's go back. Let's do the 8-month potato. Like, that 8-month potato ain't giving me nothing, right? Like, I'm just cleaning its poop and it's fighting me. I don't want to
Yeah.
do that. I want to go
Probably
back
saying,
to,
Mommy, I want mommy.
oh yeah, mommy's my favorite. Let's talk about that, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh my God. Stop fighting it, right? There are these normal things that provoke, right? So when my 4-year-old says, I want mommy to put me to bed, I get angry. Why do I get angry? I get
Mm-hmm.
angry because my anger response is protecting me from that shame response. And that shame response says, see, you're not good enough. See, he doesn't love you as much as her. Right. And if I can't process through that, it's never going to get better. It's just going to get worse. I'm going to try to control my kid. I'm going to try to fight my kid. All of this conscious parenting stuff
Or avoid your
emerges.
kid, right?
Yeah,
Like,
sure. Or avoid your kid. Right. And so I'm just going to go work, and then I'll come home and don't
I've
drink a
been,
beer and lay on the
yeah,
couch. And,
I've been rejected too much.
right.
Obviously, they want mommy. Why should I show up? Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. Right. 3 classic responses. I'm either trying to control, people please, or avoid, right? It's one of the 3. It's always one of the 3. So what does that mean? So conscious parenting, right? Conscious parenting emerges out of a context where we're no longer trying to scare our kids so bad they stop doing things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We're trying to remove we're going from, I'm going to hit you until you stop doing what I don't want you to do,
Mm-hmm.
to this new thing that we're trying to figure out all together, which is like, how do we follow the child's natural development? How do we encourage and engage them? And what it means is parents are going to have to deal with their BS. Parents are going to have to deal with their desire to control, their desire to avoid, their desire to make their kids happy, their need to get love from their children, which if you talk to anybody who's having, issues with, like in therapy, business, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
people who are having issues with their parents, right, almost always has to do with the fact that the parent has made that child responsible for their emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And, how do we avoid that trap, right?
Or
How do
the
we get out of that
well-being.
cycle? Right.
Yeah, because not
Right.
only like emotional, but like I have several high achievers that I work with that had to, they were, I hate saying neglected, but I mean, for lack of better words, neglected, right? Like they were in charge of their own safety and they were in charge of their parents' safety sometimes because their parents may have not had stable jobs or just weren't stable emotionally and making really poor choices. And the child was having to suffer those consequences as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely, conscious parenting thing is, whew, it's definitely it takes a lot of control in dealing with
Hard.
your own impulses and instincts because, hearing your kid have a tantrum and um especially as a therapist, I don't know about you, but when my kid is having a full down, like especially at the beginning, when he was just a full blown meltdown, I would be like, oh my gosh, everyone's judging me. I'm a therapist and I'm supposed to like have better behaved kids than this. And realizing it's fine. It's fine. It's not about me. It's not about me. It's that this is a natural child thing. Right. But I think a lot of adults struggle with that. And I've seen it at sporting events. Like if your kid isn't doing the best that day and the parents over there, like, you should be doing better. Like, listen, blah, 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 like
Yeah.
berating their child publicly, like humiliating their child. Let's just
Right.
call it what it is. It's humiliating your child, embarrassing them. But it's like a trigger internally, right? Like
Total.
you are definitely being triggered by your child's performance as a like defining moment of who you are as a parent. It's like,
Total.
let's just roll up, especially for those high achievers. It's like, let's roll it back just a minute,
Well, and for using the two examples you just gave, the first one, when you're talking about your feeling embarrassed around your child's tantrum or behavior,
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about the shame system. You're talking about my child behaving this way means I'm not good enough, right? And I have to contend with that feeling again, rooted in childhood, right, of not
Yeah.
being enough. But then the guy at the sports thing yelling at his kid, and which is again more like, so you see your child having a tantrum and you're like, oh no, I'm not being a good, I see my child having a tantrum and my immediate response is like, in my head goes, cut that shit out.
Yeah.
Right. And I have to back it up and it doesn't come out anymore. Right. But I have to negotiate that internal response. That's that fight response. That's that fix response
Yeah.
that is directed. It's projecting the emotion externally so that I don't have to feel it or engage with it. So in those cases, unfortunately, there's a bit longer of a process. So not only do I have to work through that anger, I have to work through that shame or fear hidden underneath the anger that says either there's something wrong about me that this is happening, or that if I don't make this stop now, it'll keep going on forever. That's more the
Uh-huh.
fear response, right?
Uh-huh.
And that anger emerges to manage, usually one of those two responses, usually the fear response, but it can be conditioned into shame as well. And so, I think again, you see that a lot more probably for guys. Certainly it happens for women, but that anger response as a way of distancing ourselves from the emotional pain, and we don't even realize we're doing it. And if I said that to somebody on the street, they would go, I don't know what you're freaking talking about, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
only through that deeper work that you're able to see those layers. But what I find working with guys, working with high achievers, working with business owners, and again, there's plenty of women. Honestly, most of my, not all, 60%, I'm 60% women. I have a lot of high achieving, powerful women that I work with. And
Yeah.
I love working with women because it's usually easier. Uh, it,
It's funny that you say that because I love working with men because I find like the left side logic, like I love it. I'm like, when they connect those dots,
yeah,
they implement, they're less, I hate saying less feeling, right? It's not like as a therapist, like feel the feelings, but still like they're, I guess the fixer in them. They're like, I'm gonna fix it. And
yeah.
they're determined. But anyway, sorry, go back.
No, it's good, right? It's what I find to be most helpful is to help them see the pattern and see how it exists both at work and at home and in
Yes.
their relationship with themselves,
Yes.
rather than viewing it, because I think it's hardest to do that work in the context you're least comfortable in. And so if
Yeah.
they're least comfortable in the context of home, that's going to be the hardest context. But if I can help you see the same pattern emerging at work and you feel more
Yes.
capable there and more
Yes.
engaged, then we can do that work, and that work, it generalizes,
Yeah.
right? And that's why I'm not so much strategy tactics based. I'm not like, hey, try this, hey, do this, hey, I used to be. I really don't anymore. I operate from the belief that, all my clients have the kind of internal wisdom
Mm-hmm.
that once they can connect with that authentic self, internal wisdom, they can get to those solutions themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But my job is to help them understand the underlying patterns that operate between those different
Yes.
contexts and those different situations, work on the emotion, because that's the hardest thing to do, learn skills and tools for doing that so that they can do that in real time at work, at home, with themselves, whatever. And then you sort of see the changes, on both sides.
I love that because that when I work with my clients, I always ask the questions like that, essentially like, how is this showing up in your family? How is this
Yeah.
showing up in your relationship with your spouse? What about at work? How, but finding those subconscious drivers
Yeah.
that those limiting beliefs or subconscious beliefs, whatever you want to call them, right?
Yeah.
Negative cognitions in the world of EMDR, and seeing how they actually show up in different areas of your life. Because oftentimes I'm sure this is what you see too, that like, I'm so successful at work, but I can't seem to, I'm struggling at home. There's
Yeah.
a lot of arguments or, your parenting just shows up with a lot of tension and frustration. And um, they compartmentalize it, and it's hard for them to see how what you might be successful in one area, but whatever it's that you're struggling in these other areas are actually probably translating into the business side too,
Yeah.
and
And
vice
and
versa.
and you can't see it because, it's invisible to you, or it's buried under a couple layers, or
Mm-hmm.
you are, I thought I was the most freaking self-aware person, and I didn't understand how much my anger was damaging, coworker relationships,
Mm-hmm.
or how it was changing how people perceived me. But because I was getting the results I wanted, I didn't have to worry about any of that. I had
Mm-hmm.
a full caseload. Most people were nice to me. I didn't,
Yeah.
right? And I couldn't see the ways, and it showed up everywhere. Like, you can, I try to direct people towards their relationships with inanimate objects, because it's the most like simplified. So it's like, you can ask questions like, a good one for me is like, so what's your relationship with your lawn like? Okay, why am I asking that question? Well, I get angry when my lawn doesn't look right, when something's wrong. Why do I get angry? Actually, because I'm scared that when I go to sell the house, that something will be wrong with my lawn, and I'll miss out on $1,000, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's that perfectionism, and there's that fear, and it's presenting itself with a lawn, right? And so where else is that same dynamic presenting itself, right? If I can't get my child to behave a certain way in this situation, he's going to keep repeating negative behavior that's going to hurt me. Same thing, right? If I
Mm-hmm.
can't, get this thing the way I want it to be at work, then it's going to keep causing me pain. But at work, it's easy. I implement a new process. I change my marketing. I
Mm-hmm.
that. And it's much easier and it's much more accessible. So I'm not maybe seeing the dysfunction as easily as I might see it in other contexts.
So that brings me to ask, essentially, do you find that parents who struggle to be present for their children, whether they just increase their hours, right? They're working, um, and they use that kind of as an excuse, like, I work so much and I have to get all these things done. Is there a certain level of maybe shame or fear of like connection or rejection within the family system?
I would assume, but it's hard because when we use these big words, right? As therapists, we're not afraid, like, oh, there's the fear of this operating, and people go, I don't know what you're freaking talking about, right?
Uh-huh.
Because what they notice is I sit with my kids and I'm uncomfortable, and I
Yeah.
pull out my phone, or I'm thinking about
There you
work,
go.
or right. So they're not like going, oh yeah, I'm scared,
I'm
like, or
scared of
I
connection.
feel
Yeah.
shame or whatever, right? It's, on some level, again, like as with any, take the phone, for example, as with any addiction, I'm using a particular thing to mask a particular thing, right?
Mhm.
So the question I will ask people is like, so sit there with your kids for 20 minutes, throw the phone away. You can't get it, right? What are you feeling? What's going on? Right? Really, really sit with it, right? And it's probably this whirlwind, really,
Yeah.
right? Oh my God, what if my kid doesn't learn how to count before the age of X? And what about this? And why aren't they like this? And I can't get their attention. And why do they keep following me around? And why, any of those things, right? All of that stuff, right? That, we may be able to more easily identify, oh, that's anxiety, or,
Mhm.
oh, I feel a little guilty, or I feel a little frustrated. We can identify what's on the surface. It's the tip of the iceberg of these embedded fears, beliefs,
Mhm.
expectations. And it can be hard to work into that. It can be hard to see that at first, right? And
Mhm.
so you just have to be patient as you meet the client where they're at, working through where they identify the problem is, before you go to those big giant, right? Oh, you're afraid of, and they're like, no, screw you. You don't know what you're talking, right? Okay, so we'll get there together, right? I wish I could just go, probably in the first half an hour of knowing a client, I know 80% of the bullshit that's going on for them, right? But I
Mhm.
can't, I've tried it. I used to try, here's what's going on. Nope, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay. And then 3 years later, right, we've slowly unpacked and gotten to that point. You just have to follow them where they're at. So I think just trying to make this as tangible as possible. If you're a high performer, high achiever, if you're a business owner converting into parenthood or whatever, my sort of instruction for anybody is, I want you to intentionally take 10, 15, 20 minutes when you're with your kid, get the phone out of the room, lock it in a box somewhere so you can't do it. No doing the dishes, no cooking, no, like just just play, just sit. What's coming up for you? And I think you're going to find it sounds like static. It's like, I was going like there's probably a bunch of stuff coming
Mhm.
up. And the way I would frame it as, this experience is an invitation into healing and growth. And it's up to you if you're going to take on that challenge, right? What is that? Expanding our consciousness, moving more deeply into love, understanding a greater conception of who we are as humans, right? What does that look like? That looks like me showing up in the small moments and being present and giving loving energy to my kids and exchanging joyful experiences with them. And if I'm struggling to do that, if I'm struggling to find joy in what's right in front of me, come on, that's a problem,
Mhm.
right? If I'm struggling to engage in a way that feels meaningful to me, come on, that's a problem. And it's
Yeah.
not just about reading another parenting book and getting more strategies. It's about really taking the time to sit with that discomfort that comes up, to understand the pain that's underneath that, to begin to explore that abstract space of, stored up pain that's creating these automatic responses, and give space to healing that. Don't just grow more strategies and techniques on top of it to shove it down even further. And that can be an uncomfortable experience. But if
Mhm.
you can sort of see it as a journey that's going to unfold, especially in the early stages of your parenting, it gets a lot easier ish. But it's going to be a journey. It's going to be a process. And this is true for a dad, for a mom, for a high performer, for anybody who's noticing the discomfort arising in the
Mhm.
experience of parenting.
Mhm. Yeah. I don't know. I'm over here doodling on my Sketchpad 20-minute challenge. So that's definitely something I'm going to tell people about from this podcast. But rejection just comes up for me when you
Yeah.
talk about that, like that vulnerability to sit with your child for 20 minutes without your cell phone, and the fear maybe of like how uncomfortable that is fearing to a certain degree that your kid may not reciprocate, right? Like that you're not showing up good enough for your kid, and that fear of being rejected in some form or another. That's what came up for me, you know?
Yeah. So I will put you on the spot as like, my hope for you in all of this, Adriana, is that you'll find this process to be helpful in many different ways. And one of the ways, when I say this process, I mean doing this podcast. I think you'll find that this is an amazing invitation into noticing what's coming up for you, right? And you've said several times as we've been talking through this shame response, this fear of rejection, right? Which is, again, one of the three big fears, right? Fear of loss of control, fear of rejection, fear of change, right? These are the three core fears. And, I would certainly say that's a fear of mine, right? I'm afraid my kids won't love me, but I am much more afraid that my kids won't turn out the way I think they should be in order to be okay, right? And that's more of that control response. And so just being able to notice, like, as you go through this, okay. And again, this is the advanced stuff, right? This is the stuff you've done the trauma work. You agree these patterns exist. You can see these patterns, right? Is it an issue with control? Is it an issue with rejection? Is it an issue with change? Right. And all of those are going to move into the process some way, somehow. But we're each going to have, our particular constellation of that.
You mentioned playing with your kids, right? And you'll often hear adults say, I don't know how to play with my kid.
Yeah.
And as clinicians, we get curious about that. Like, is there trauma, right? Like relational trauma. Because that is such an important aspect of the human existence, is learning to play. If you didn't get a chance to really do that well as a child, or even after experiencing PTSD, as you'll know, Bessel van der Kolk will talk about, like, we lose creativity, right? After trauma. And part of playing is creativity. So, but I feel like for many parents that the idea of sitting for 20 minutes with no phone, no distractions, and not just being present, but entering that kid's world instead of having them enter your own world, without criticism, because it's like everyone has their own different thing. Like you said, your fear is more, I'm not going to create these kids that are going to be, what I hope they should be in the future. That's where, like you said, criticism is part of your struggle. So it's easy to come in and be like, let me correct this or correct that. And the message that gives that kid is, I'm not good enough, right? I'm expected to be perfect or whatever, right?
And the cycle continues.
And the cycle continues and you don't even realize it, right? And so, criticism was definitely part of my upbringing. And I've had to like learn, even just celebrating my kids' losses, like for sports, and their wins, with just saying, you guys did great, without feeling the need to be like, did you notice when you did this? You might want to consider blah, 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 blah. So it's like, practicing a lot of self-control in those moments where I'm realizing, wait a second, this is going to come out as criticism. And I get, like the idea that feedback from someone you don't know is criticism, but feedback from someone you do know can also be criticism, right?
Yeah.
What is it? Feedback without connection is criticism. I don't remember what that saying is, but yes, back to I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about, instead of the people who are transitioning into fatherhood, maybe the people who have been fathers for umpteen years now, and maybe their kids are about to leave the nest, right? And the fear or the realization of, wow, they're about to leave, and I feel like I didn't have the time, good quality time with them. Like, and they're realizing they wanted to change that dynamic. What can you say to that, and how we, men and women both, can learn to balance business and entering fatherhood or motherhood?
Yeah.
Motherhood.
So what came to mind as you started asking the question, which is not exactly what you asked, but I will answer what you asked, is I had this client come to me 6-7 years ago. And the first thing she said was, I love my kids, but I don't like them. And she was a, full-time head honcho, high performer, whatever. And she had spent a long time struggling with the relationship with her children to the point where she felt so fractured and disconnected. And, flash forward a bunch of years, she's been able to do the work to change that. And it was before her kids launched, you would say in the middle of her kid's life, right? And she actually had ended up having a kid later through that process, and her ability to parent that child was totally different. And what it, again, same kind of stuff. What it took was going through all of that, all that yuck that had created damage within the context of the relationships. And so whether it's, at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, right? Okay, your kids are launching and they're about to leave and you have this realization, it's still the same thing. It's now you got to do the work and understand that between the ages of, it's different for everybody, 11, 12, 13, 14, when you notice your kids really starting to individuate, when they're really trying to separate, when they're really trying to rebel, there is this period of time, I believe, and I could be wrong, where like, honestly, it's kind of too late for a bit. Like you just need to accept where things are at and do the work on yourself so that when they're ready to return, which usually begins happening in like the early 20s, they start calling you and asking about problems, right? That you can rebuild that relationship. And I've seen that, I've done that work with a number of different parents who, have kids with me, maybe severe mental health issues that don't want to go to therapy, as an example. And so their kids aren't going to do that, but they recognize this schism. And what I tell them they have control over is rebuilding that relationship and making sure that child can come to you without feeling criticized. They can feel loved. You can focus on the things that build that relationship rather than tear it down, so that when they get to that place where they're trying to navigate through their challenges, you've recreated that safe, stable base. You've started to repair that relationship so that they can come back and they can ask you questions. And it may be that you're a better adult parent than you are a kid parent. Cool. Okay. That is what it is, right? We can't go backwards. We can't do it again. But what you can do is you can be vulnerable about your new journey.
Don't you know we're talking to men here, and most men hear the word vulnerable and they just cringe.
Authentic, open. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. I honestly, and maybe it's a cultural thing because I know you're in Texas and I'm in Michigan, so maybe it's a little different. I have had so much success with men in vulnerability. I think we're craving it. I think we want to be real. We just don't know how. I think we want to be authentic and form connection, and we just don't know how because we've spent so long with the image, whatever. I invite parents, no matter what the stage of their life, to go on that personal growth journey, to be open with their kids, right? To instead of tell their kids what they should do, tell their kids a story about a time they felt the same way and how challenging it was. And that's the stuff that begins rebuilding those relationships, right? When your 11-year-old, 14-year-old, 21-year-old comes to you and says, oh my God, this is so hard. I have this pain. I have this problem. Instead of going, well, you should do this, or you should try this, or you should do that. Try relating to that emotion. Try telling a story about a time you felt the same way. Move into the connection first and foremost, and allow them watch as they begin solution generating in front of you. Watch as they begin trying new ways of solving the problem that you couldn't have even come up with, But in order to do that, you have to learn how to tolerate the emotional pain that arises when they come to you in that discussion. And what most people don't understand is they're reflexively avoiding or masking or, doing something so they don't have to feel that pain. That's why I go into fix mode. I go into fix mode so I don't have to feel the pain that my child is preventing in that moment. And so that's, again, really the secret sauce in my mind.
I want to wrap this up in like a little pretty bow. And I feel like the last question or objection I might hear from someone listening to this would be, I cannot have a successful business and be a successful business leader without that level of sacrifice, without, basically putting my spouse and my family and my children in that second seat.
Yeah. My initial reaction is bullshit, but I know that's not helpful. So, what would I say to that? I think that is, a pattern you've accumulated to distance yourself from certain pain. And when I do that, like, well, I've got to go and do this, honestly, I can't think of a time that I've said that hasn't been because on some level I felt uncomfortable doing the parenting thing. Mm-hmm. And it's just easier to come back over here and build the thing that I know how to build. I deeply believe that any most extremes are led by fear. Mm-hmm. And that unhealed fear will create toxicity inside the context of your business. So I can pretty much assure you that the things your kids are feeling, your employees are feeling. I can pretty much assure you the things that your kids are feeling, your employees are feeling, your customers are feeling. And it leader creates the emotional tone that exudes itself through everything they create. And if you are seeing profits, but you ask, somebody 2 or 3 rungs down from you how they feel, I bet you they feel similarly to the way your kids feel. And you might get some reaction like, we don't feel like management cares enough about our situation.
Yeah. Unappreciated.
Right? Yeah. And my view of the future, my view of the world I'm trying to create, and I see this all the time with, again, I do coaching, I do a lot of training and it's through the fabric of coaching, but it's consulting-ish. I work with businesses, and what I see is businesses being able to implement a balanced approach to the business is responsible for some things, but we can also empower the individuals to be responsible for meeting their needs and find a happy synergy between those things to create a healthy business built on healthy employees, or at least if maybe healthy employees is going too far, employees on the journey towards, healthy health, wellness, right? But it always starts with the leader. You can't implement a wellness program halfway into the business and hope it's going to, because there's going to be culture that counteracts the implementation of that wellness program from the top down, right? Yeah. And so I'm very big on, if I can target the leaders, if I can target the head honchos and then help them understand how to implement those things at different levels inside their business, that's where you see healthy business. That's where you see loyal customers that want to come back again and again because they go to your business and they're fed. They feel more full, right? And I can guarantee you, even though we don't talk about these things, even though these things that can be hard to see, as you heal, you'll watch people being drawn to you in this new way, this way of, you can't even really explain. It's just, they feel safe around you because you feel safe. They feel seen around you because you feel seen. And whether you're a business leader, whether you're focused on your kids or your customers or your employees or your stakeholders or your synergistic partners in the marketplace, creating sustainable relationships and mutually beneficial outcomes is always based on the health of the individuals operating within that context.
Yes. My first place of employment, I worked in the corporate world before I became a therapist. My first place of employment, people were so loyal to that organization because they felt seen, they felt taken care of. I mean, they implemented having massages like twice a week for their employees. And
I'm in.
And the crazy thing is, at the time, they were not, like, in terms of salary, they were not getting paid the most, but all of these other benefits and just the culture of the company created a lot of loyal employees. So,
we want to feel safe,
yes.
right? That's one of our core needs. Money is one way we can feel safe, but it's not the only way. There's a bunch of other ways to make employees feel safe. Right? We need connection. We need relationship, right? There's a bunch of ways to help employees feel seen and cared for, right? We all need identity and impact. There's a bunch of ways to help employees feel like they're making an impact, right? It's just Maslow's hierarchy in business, right?
I just want to kind of bring this session to an end, or that session, this podcast episode. You see the therapist.
Yeah. Time to wind down. Yeah, good.
But I want to bring a thought that came to my mind, basically, which was just, what would business look like in America or everywhere, right? Because it's not just here in the United States. But what would business look like if all of management, all of those who desire to move into a management role, were required to take some level of emotional intelligence and like working through those subconscious beliefs, which,
coaching therapy,
which, for therapist-informed trauma, we just lump a lot of that in as it's trauma, but even just adverse experiences throughout our life. If we were just, encouraged to embrace that process, how that would unfold in business with leadership roles with your employees and just your customers, how that would just translate into a healthier society, in my view. I don't know. I don't have this idealistic view of the world. Like, if we just all did therapy, again, we go back to you get therapy, Oprah Winfrey style, right? So anyway, but I really appreciate you coming in to share all of your insight on, and just your vulnerability around becoming a father and being an entrepreneur and what that looks like and what it looks like in the people that you coach or consult with, because it is such an important conversation to have with business leaders and fathers in general, because it's a juggle. Like, moving into parenthood is a juggle, and confronting a lot of these fears or all the different things that come up, because they're not going to see it as a fear, just the avoidance or fear. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. So, Matthew, 100%. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah. And you're welcome. And if I can say that is my vision of the world, that if the leaders can do this work, they can enable and empower other people that don't have that same freedom or power to do that work, the world could change significantly. Whether it's families, businesses, communities, right?
Yeah.
We've already seen it happen. And all the different, healers and helpers you're having on your podcast, we all have a different role to play, but we're all a big part of that system, helping to move our world forward through that healing experience. And there's really cool stuff on the other side. We've got to go flow state, right? Being able to live in peak performance, but that comes as a result, not of high performance, but of healthy performance, right? Holistic performance. And I think we can do that work. But sometimes it starts in your family. Sometimes it starts in your business, usually both.
Maybe we should take a lesson from you and aspire to be peak performers, not high achieving performers.
It's a different feeling, right? So that feeling you feel when because we talked about a lot of cruddy stuff. So let's just end on something like really positive, right? The feeling you feel like when you're in nature, or the feeling you feel when you're in some sort of peak athletic experience, or the feeling you feel when you're in some sort of creative peak experience or business, right? You can feel that with your family. And a lot of people do. And you can learn how to do that. Whether the easy thing is take your kids on the hike or take your kids skiing or whatever, and that'll get you part of the way. But if you can create a nervous system that allows you to experience peak performance in the midst of that chaos called parenting, oh boy, if you can do that, you can do anything. right?
Yes.
And if you've learned how to do that in business, which, again, for me, I have, and I teach other people how to do that, you can learn how to do that at home. So it's not just make the pain go away. It's find joy, find peace, find love, find peak experience inside the context of parenting, not just manage the problems. And that's, for me, that's what I'm shooting for.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Matthew. And of course, I will be having you back on sometime in the near future. So for those of you who have loved this episode and love hearing Matthew talk, this is not the last time you will hear from him.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you letting me be here.
And he does have ways to get a hold of him. I'll make sure and post all of the information in the notes, the show notes, and you'll be able to contact him if you want to inquire about his services or just additional information. If you have any questions, you'll be able to contact him directly, or you can also contact me if you have any other questions or valuable insight that you'd love to share. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the Overcoming Podcast.